we will be discussing about food waste reduction solutions and resources to inspire a system-wide action. It is my honor and privilege to host this event with the support of REFED, a renowned US nonprofit dedicated to ending food loss and waste across the US food system by advancing data-driven solutions. So thank you, Alejandro, for being here today. Alejandro is REFED's Capital, Innovation, and Engagement Manager. He's been working to connect capital providers with the innovative businesses and organizations developing solutions to food waste challenge. Alejandro has broad experience in technology investments, banking, equity research, and sales and trading experience. So thank you, Alejandro, for being today. We welcome you. And we will start this workshop with a presentation by Alejandro, and just to give you a general idea of what are the topics that we'll be addressing through this workshop. First, we will be understanding what has been the progress in food waste in the US since the first roadmap from the REFED was published in 2016. We will learn how REFED's work today accelerates actionable solutions from the engagement of different stakeholders. And then we will address some of the key R&D gaps to accelerate innovative solutions, to end with a discussion of how all of these efforts and the learning experience of REFED in the US can serve as an inspiration for international action, and what have been some of the initiatives that have already started around the world from this collaboration. So Alejandro, please, I will stop sharing my screen. Please feel free to share yours and start your presentation.
Perfect. Olivia, thank you.
For everyone in the audience, please, if you have some questions, you can leave those in the chat and we can address in the Q&A and the discussion panel at the end. Sorry for that.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really excited to speak with all of you today. Olivia gave, I guess, a nice overview of myself, so I'm not going to talk about myself, but I do want to plug REFED. So to be able to just like describe what REFED does is that, think of REFED as we were born by creating food waste data in 2016. And so it all started off as like a PDF report that we sent out, like, oh, like these are the X number of solutions that we think people need to adopt in the US, whether it's businesses, governments, et cetera. And that's how it started off. It was just like a little report, but I think as time has gone on, there's been more demand as to like, okay, like how can you actually track the data beyond just like one fixed period of time? And so we embarked on, I would say, a journey to try to refresh that data up until basically last year, which is 2019, 2020. And so that's what's led us to create a new product called the Insights Engine, which I'll talk a bit more about. But REFED itself, as I've probably alluded to, is primarily focused on the data, which is like, you'll see that's the data and insights part. And then where I tend to live is more the capital innovation. So when you think of REFED now having the data of like how to act on certain things, then it's like, okay, like how do we spur action, whether it's on the capital side, providing funding for specific ideas, whether they're like very early stage, or on the stakeholder engagement side, where it's you're getting it adopted by other food businesses. So like if someone wants to change up the way they manufacture something, presenting that idea to someone who ultimately may adopt that technology. And that's what REFED tries to do, is they try to sit at the top and then connect where appropriate. But basically today, I think I want to talk, and everyone here probably knows about the food waste challenge, that it's huge, it's complicated, and there's no like, what makes it so frustrating is that there's like no solution that can like span across, or you can apply it and then all of food waste disappears. It's probably like going to be a series of solutions that can help like deal with the problem, and like depending on geographic context, it's going to be different, just based on like how economies work and whatnot. And so how we are looking at the problem, at least in the US, is like we're working towards a 50% national international goal of reducing food waste by half by 2030. And so that is what was rooted in our analysis. Another thing to level set our analysis versus like other people is because we know that there's many different metrics. Like in Europe, they've got a specific like food waste target. UN has one too. We're looking at it from like a surplus food standpoint. And so what that includes is it will include food waste, but it also includes all the other stuff, like whether it's like food donation, animal feed, composting, because we want to have a good sense of like overall what is like being, basically think of it, it's like, it's food that is not being used for its ultimate purpose, or like its like main purpose. So food that's like made that goes unused or like unsold. So we wanted to factor in like certain areas where like food might be flowing into. So that's why we didn't want to ignore food donation, for instance, or even like the recycling, because like those are still important solutions. And yes, it does fall under food waste, but I think we want to track like that level of data. So just to level set, this is when I talk about like food waste, we're going to be talking about surplus food. So it's all the food that basically goes unsold or unused. And so basically after we did our analysis, from 2010 all the way up until now, we've noticed that like unfortunately, like the US is maybe not, you can see this, like there's an 11.9 growth overall in terms of tons of food that's being generated that is surplus. And so like this is progressing, maybe not in the best way, except one thing I do want to highlight is that food waste has actually leveled off from 2016 to 2020. I don't want to attribute the fact that, oh, like Refed produced a report in 2016, because like it's much more complicated than that. But I would say that like it's become more of an issue that people are focusing in on in the US. So we are seeing like, as like consumers are a little more mindful of it, but as also businesses take action on it, we're seeing a leveling off. But that is also to say that we've still seen this 12% growth since 2010. So that's something we need to worry about. And then on a per capita basis, which is quite interesting, is we are seeing a very slight decrease of 2% in the US since 2016. And so that's a positive movement. Once again, like attributed to like people focusing in on it more, but this is still just baby steps towards like what we need to get of like 50% to 2%, like vastly different. But that's sort of where we're at right now. I'm going to try to zoom through the slides because I think my value is I want to show the tool that we made and then see how everyone here can actually use it. But there's one thing that like people ask, okay, like what's happened when it comes to the pandemic relative to like food waste? And so because right now we only have till 2019, based on the data that we're getting right now, and we're still in the process of cleaning it up so that we can present like 100% good insights for 2020, is that basically, I think everyone knows that we did see like in the US huge spikes of food waste in the early days of the pandemic, largely because supply chains shut down. Let's say like farm workers are not able to go to work. Food processing plants were either like in certain cases shut down or not able to run at full capacity. And so we had little parts of the supply chain that didn't necessarily work. And so we had food waste happening then. That being said, like I would say maybe 7 months into it, there was a good amount of adjustment that any sort of big shocks that happened early on ended up getting normalized throughout the year. And in addition to that, I think we also, like a positive trend for food waste is that during the pandemic, a lot of people, at least in the US and like the developed world context, started reflecting more on how they were eating, their like food habits. And so being more mindful of that actually like has helped contribute, at least like for a little bit, reducing food waste at home. And I don't know if Refed really fully took advantage of this, but because this was like almost a once in a generation moment for consumers to try to get good habits in, that was like an opportunity like for, let's say, any society or any group of people to really like hone in on food waste, at least at home. And so I think we like to talk about big numbers, like in the US, for instance, we see that surplus food is valued at like 400 billion effectively. That's like, honestly, when you talk about huge numbers like that, it's almost meaningless, but I would root it down towards it's 2% of US GDP. So it, although it's a small amount, it is still pretty meaningful that it's just food that's ending up not actually being consumed or used. Like that's what's happening to it. It's just almost lost, but, and it's stuff that we could try to fix. And basically, I also want to root this discussion on the fact that when it comes to food waste, it's a huge climate, it has a very big climate implication. So even though I've talked about 2% of GDP, the fact is that 2% of GDP is also huge when you think about it from like a freshwater perspective. Like 14% of like food that's being wasted, or like food that's being wasted accounts for 14% of freshwater use in the US, which is incredible when you think about it, and 18% of cropland use. So it's just like, these are key stats for us to like think about, oh, like food waste does need to be an issue, even if it like monetarily sometimes it doesn't make sense. Like on other aspects, it is very, I would say like very impactful to focus in on. And the other thing I also root to this, and depending on geographic context, it could be different, but like in the US, for instance, having this like amount where you say that $400 billion of food is being wasted, and we've got 1.6, or like 1 out of 6 Americans is food insecure, like that seems very silly when you like want to think of it from like a society perspective. And so like we see it like people who are food insecure, food waste is definitely like one solution that can help those that are like hungry or need sustenance. And so one other thing that I want to show, and this thing I think is a little, it's dependent again on like geography, but at least from a US context, we see that waste occurs like across the whole supply chain. And one thing that we found very interesting was actually on the residential end. It ends up being almost like 37% of the waste that happens throughout the supply chain occurs at home. Let's say if you're looking at more like from a developing country perspective, I would say this number skews down and it increases like higher in the supply chain. But I think like roughly it ends up being pretty similar based on like the numbers that I've seen from like Maersk Growth, for instance, and IBM Food Trust. So I think like this is pretty interesting. Like now that you know where food waste is occurring, it's like, okay, what are the solutions that can actually fit into that? And so I'm going to pause right there because I think what's going to be more impactful is myself showing our Insights Engine tool. Because I think this is basically like a better look at it versus the slides. And so at the end of this discussion, I would imagine like ISST will send out like a link to the Insights Engine as well for people to play around with. But I would say like this is the tool that we came up with when it comes to like food waste. Like our food waste analysis can be presented here, and anyone who wants to like start looking at like ways that they can participate in like the food waste challenge, this is, I think, a good starting point. Once again, this is the US context, but I think that it can be applied like in certain areas, like across the world, particularly I would say the solutions database. But I'll start it off with the food waste monitor. So think of it as like almost 4 different tools. The food waste monitor is how users will come in here to first look at like percentage of food waste that's happening in the US. And so basically all the slides that I talked about in the beginning of showing like, oh, like this is where food waste is happening, this is what's going on here. That's basically the insights that come from this. And so this shows like where food waste is happening or where surplus food is happening over time. And you can click in to see like, okay, like for surplus food tons, where is it actually like ending up? And so at least in the US context, we see it's 34% going into landfill versus we've got a bit going into composting. And then there's I would say like less than 20% of it that's just not even harvested. So that's nutrients that go into the soil afterwards. So I'd say like that's not the worst thing. But I think just to keep in mind, this is a breakdown of where we've found like food waste has gone into. And we also have a breakdown on food types. So let's say if it's produce versus prepared, we have it on causes as well. So we attribute causes based on like, I would say like, as it goes throughout the supply chain, we determine like, okay, like this is the root cause of it. And then I think this is actually pretty interesting because then you'll know, okay, like if that's the true cause, then you can come up with the real solution. So this is one thing that has, I think, boggled the US, Canada, where I'm actually based out of, and like a few of like the European countries, which is date label concerns. And by that problem, I mean that date labeling tends to be very inconsistent. It's like, use this apple juice by X date, or best before X date, or like recommended use by X date. And so these dates tend to be, I would say, like the most conservative possible date that the manufacturer is willing to put on it. And then as a result, users or people at home like that don't necessarily know what this like recommended best before date is. They interpret that as like it is expired then, and then they dump out the product. So I think like that's an area where I think we need a little more education on. But like, as you can see with each of these like causes of food waste, there are readily like solutions that you can think of. And then lastly is another view that I think I showed in the slide deck, which is like the sectors where the food waste does occur. And so once again, we go back to residential, the biggest part for the US context, but I would say it is pretty even across the whole supply chain. There was one thing I also wanted to talk about, which is our data quality. So this is, when it comes to like refed and the data, I would say like all the data that we have here is sourced from either like our surveys that we go out to the public or to, let's say, individual food businesses. We also collected data from various studies around the world. Well, mostly from the US and Canada, or like equivalent studies, but that's where like a lot of our data is coming from. And then additionally, we got support from Deloitte when it comes to actually modeling out some of these solutions that I'll show you later. But how that ties back to the data quality is that there are certain areas where like our insights are almost like an aggregate of a bunch of studies. And there are certain areas where like we just don't have a lot of good data. And I'll give an example. When it comes to, if you were to look at retail causes, we've got a low data score of like 1. And what refed didn't want to do is we didn't want to like wait until our data was 100% perfect before sending it out to the public. I think we wanted to give like this framework, and then hopefully as like data comes available, as like scientists and researchers like yourselves start to come up with better like applicable studies, we would put that into this tool, and then this would just aggregate all the information. But one problem that we have here is why this is a low data score, is when you think of it from retail and causes, this data is basically, imagine a grocery store where there's food that's gone expired. Usually what happens there and how they record it is that they have usually a clerk that works at the grocery store that'll like basically mark the product that's expired on their little app, and then it gets like thrown out. And then they get a choice of like 5 different reasons as to why they're getting rid of the food. The problem is usually this task tends to get assigned to like people that are busy, like it's not like their prime task. So they'll look at the app and pick the first option. And so like the first option tends to be date label concerns, for instance. And so we don't know if this is 100% accurate when it comes to like grocery store waste, because they've run a study, I think like a separate one, where they just flipped it around and they put like handling errors being the first option that people could pick. And that ended up being the one that most people picked. So that's why the data here, I think we're dealing with it. We want to get a little more robust. But that's just like, I think, an example of like how hard it is to get good like food waste data in the space. And so that handles the food waste monitor. The next tool that I want to talk about is like, okay, now that you know where food waste is happening and like why it's happening, here are the solutions that we'd recommend people to adopt. And so I think this area, I think, is actually quite applicable to like the global context, because maybe like your economy may not work the same way the US does, like in certain cases, like with donations having like tax incentives in the US. But we have a list of solutions that people can explore and then think from their perspective, like, does this make sense within our like context? And so we have it right now ordered on like net financial benefit. So the most I don't want to say profitable, because that's not what we're going for here. This factors in like, let's say, food that's fed to people, the cost of like implementing a solution and like the whole society's benefit. We see that like portion sizes, for instance, ends up being the one that like gets the most bang for your buck. But we also do this on like tons as well. So like the amount of food waste tons that can be addressed by each one. And so you see composting and more of like the recycling solutions end up being the solutions that are more favored. But then we also look at it from like a climate perspective. So what are the things that'll be best for like a GHG or like a GHG or greenhouse gas emissions standpoint? And then we order it down by area. And then we keep on going it as well. Like we've got water, we've got number of meals if you end up like, let's say, like preventing that waste, and then jobs that are created by adopting a certain solution. But yeah, I would say that looking at this, look at it from like, not by the order, but like if you're looking for solutions that are for your context, look through the list to see like, okay, what ones will make sense. And if you're really focused on a certain area of like the supply chain, then I would almost click in for stakeholder view. So let's say I work like with food service. So like I'm a restaurateur, or like I help advise restaurants. You would select this one, and then you could end up seeing the top solutions that would fall for specifically the restaurant or like the food service category. And then you could just search for ones that would be the most appropriate for your context. And if you want any more details, you end up just clicking in, and we've got further details describing what the solution is. We do a financial analysis of like where we think funding can come from, but I think the most relevant is going to be like describing what the solution is. And this is actually the interesting part, is like challenges. So like what are areas that need to be overcome with this certain solution for it to be adopted. And I think we do a decent job about like not painting the whole picture like rosy and saying, oh, this is the perfect solution, like it'll solve all your problems, but rather we give you the option, and then you can realistically assess if like this ends up being something that could be adoptable, at least from your perspective. And then we do provide some stakeholder actions within each fact sheet. After that, we've got, I would say, 2 other tools. This one I think may not be the most relevant for the audience here, but this is our solution provider directory. So I guess how people come into our website is that they first learn about the issue of food waste. They learn about the solutions that can help solve food waste. And then after that, they can look at like the solution providers that are out there in the space. So if they were interested in looking for composting solutions, so if I was going to say compost, I would find compost solution providers that are near me or in the US context. That being said, I know the audience here is more global. So I would say this directory, I would almost use it as like more of like to seek out examples of organizations that could exist in the US context or like could exist globally. But I wouldn't say like this is like the area to look for like, oh, I have a problem, I need to look for a solution in my like geography of Chile, for instance. And then lastly, I want to show the impact calculator. And so this has actually been like an interesting tool for a lot of, I would say, like solution providers that we work with. Basically, how this works is that you almost like select a sector that you work in, and then you determine like, okay, basically like if I was a restaurant, let's do food service again, and how I was running it is and 50 to landfill, which is terrible, but depending on like your context, that's like, let's say that's the example. I was generating 100 tons of waste, and 50 was going to composting and 50 was going to landfill. This tool allows you to compare to if you wanted to come with an idealized state. Like if you ended up thinking, okay, I can implement another solution, and then it might reduce my impact, like from a GHG or like food perspective. So if I shifted my landfill to donations, for instance, and composting remained the same, this would be your net impact for making that decision. And so that's what I think people use this tool for, is like to calculate impact if they decide to implement food waste solutions. And that's what we're trying to like get people to use on this. I would say right now, I know we've had some questions about like getting an API for this product and then like grabbing the data and then being able to use this on like other people's like widgets. We're still in the process of thinking about that, but if this is of use to any of your anybody's work here, at least like from a solution provider perspective or like coming up with impacts, like this would be a pretty basic tool that we have to calculate it. But we also have a more detailed tool in our like methodology. So if you wanted to go more deeper than just like standard mix of food type, like if you wanted to look at emissions for mangoes, for instance, like if you're like really specifically focused on one type of food product, we have our calculations that you can download in our methodology. So if you like go into our methodology, we provide like all our detailed information here. So if there's like any interest on like impact numbers or even like where we got data from, like data sources, this is the area where you can find it. But I think that's pretty much what I'd want to talk about, at least from like a food waste standpoint on the Insights engine. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I just want to highlight like there's so many solutions out there for food waste. I realize that this slide in itself is illegible. You can't read it, but the goal is like, this is designed to show you like, there's not one type of solution that can solve everything. Like I think Refed's position is that there's so many different like buckets of solutions or so many different pieces of waste that like can be addressed by like little technology solutions here, but also even just like a rethinking of waste. Like even at home, like let's say if you had like carrots that shriveled up and dried up, but are like still edible, you can rehydrate them by putting them in water. So like even little innovations like that, like at the home, or like just thinking a bit more clearly about your waste. I think Refed thinks that like these are like little things that'll all contribute to trying to prevent and stop food waste. But I'll stop there and leave it to Olivia to jump in if there's any questions, or we can also go into the session.
Okay, thank you so much, Alejandro, for such a complete and interesting presentation. So we do have some questions from the chat, and I will start with some comments that I have. So since we were giving this event, this session, not just a US focus, but how can we learn? And I can speak for myself. So I represent a Latin American country where we have been really thinking about how can we as a country start moving towards the transition to reduce food waste. So listening to your presentation and learning from all of the efforts of the Refed, I really think that you can provide a high level understanding of the impacts of the solutions and the methodology. However, there is a big part of your design of all of these tools that is your data-driven resources, are initially designed by collecting, high quality data, and you talked about that, how challenging and how difficult it is for you to collect all of this data. So one of the thoughts that I was thinking while you were presenting is what happened in those countries, where you don't have access to high quality data, and there's no data collection at all. So it seems like if you are going to design innovative solutions based on data-driven, platforms, how can you start thinking about these alternatives when you don't have access to the data in the first place? So you can still have, the high-level understanding of the impact because your calculator provides that, and the methodology, which is great. But how do you see, in terms of the gap between, the US that already have, or you were able to collect all of these insights, in comparison to other, regions or geographies of the world that are interested in following these roadmaps and these solutions. However, they don't have the amount or quality of data. Alejandro, I think you have your microphone.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to figure out. My computer just froze. That's a good question. And I think that like in the US context, I was also like mentioning that it's so hard to get really good data. At the end of the day, I think, let's say like other like geographic contexts, like you almost have to work from like a qualitative perspective. Like getting like user stories from, let's say, like food businesses or like just organizations or people who are on the ground. Because I don't think you'll be able to get like good measures. And even like in developed countries, like we still struggle with it. It is not like, I don't think it's smooth sailing to get like good data there. So I think at the end of the day, like having a high level sense qualitatively, like what's happening is probably going to be how organizations and like, yeah, how organizations take action. Because I don't think getting like robust 5 out of 5 perfect data is going to happen.
Thank you. I do want to bring one question that came up in the chat. So this question is from Sandy Roder. So how would less meat and dairy consumption affect compare with overall food waste by pushing, the mind diet? That's a good question. Thank you, Sandy. And she provided some links about this topic as well.
That's perfect. Sandy, thank you for those thoughts. And like, I agree. When it comes to, when you think of it like an emissions perspective, let's say moving towards like a less like meat or less like beef related diet, is like hugely impactful from like a GHG perspective. And I think like, I don't want to like weigh issues and say, oh, like this will be like greater than like if you were to adopt food waste. I think like a lot of like how we solve the like climate issue is like taking on a bunch of like of these approaches. Like for those that are not, let's say, don't want to give up meat, we find ways to optimize the supply chain so that we reduce food waste. But I guess like those that are willing to go towards like the mind diet, like that, I don't want to discount it. I think it's hugely impactful. And when it comes to like us looking at food waste, one of the like highest areas to try to like reduce emissions is like, we do not want people to be wasting meat as it like travels through the supply chain, because that is the highest like emissions amount. So I think like the issue that you bring up is like pretty interconnected with food waste, but I would say like what you bring up, like it is very impactful to go down the mind diet. Yeah, those are just my thoughts. But I think like food waste, yes, we want to prevent the higher things from being wasted. So beef, dairy, like those are things that are no-goes. Produce, I don't want to favor them over produce, but I know like those are the highest emission categories.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Alejandro. And since the work of ReFed has a journey from 2016 to 2021, and you have just showed us what have been, the major efforts. I would like to know, where do you think are the most, the most progress that has been made on the food waste reduction from the U.S. experience? Where has from all of this stakeholder and different, value chain perspective, where do you think the most progress has been made?
That's a good question. I would say that, and like this is something that I also asked like all my colleagues at ReFed to see like if they had a view on it, but this goes back to the point of like having like good data, because the industry like struggles to get like baselines. Let's say like a baseline on retail, for instance, versus a baseline on manufacturing. We're not really able to tell like what like has made, at least like definitively, what has made the most progress. Qualitatively, we can say that certain areas are starting to get like more traction. So like from the US context, I would say it's more the like supply chain optimization has been getting a lot more traction, whether it's like technology solutions that track food as they go through, or like monitor temperature, or even like try to estimate the demand that a product is going to have at the end of the supply chain, so that it enables like those who are, let's say, the retailer to order the exact amount, or like, get close to the amount that they think is ideal that they'll sell. So I think that's an area that's had a lot of momentum, but it's just tough because there's no real baselines across supply chains. And I know we've got like our data as well, but like our data doesn't indicate if certain areas are progressing more than others, at least like on a prevention, rescue, or recycling aspect.
Well, but I appreciate your comments, because in a way where you see more traction and where, most investment is happening, is also kind of indicator that there is being, impact in those areas. So although you might not have all that baseline information, it is still interesting to hear from that point of view. So I have another question for you, Alejandro. So I know, reading of all of ReFed website and all of your publications, that ReFed is very focused in the importance of collaborative efforts. So I would like to hear if you would like to mention some examples of cross-sector synergies that have resulted in effective and scalable food waste solutions. And how do you think, or what do you think is driving collaboration in this space?
Okay. Cross-sector. Okay, there's a few areas that I could point to. There's been a lot of collaboration, I would say, from like, think of it as the end of the supply chain. And so I would say like the retailer / like food service provider and the donation / like recycling area. And by recycling, I mean like that would cover composting, anaerobic digestion. So that area has had a little more collaboration just because like there's a natural like partnership there where like, okay, there's food that is now ultimately going to be wasted or can't be consumed. And so we send it down those paths. At least like from a donation side, we've seen a lot more collaboration using technology. And I would say by technology, it's like, we call this coordination and matching, but basically it's, imagine like databases that a food seller can ultimately put up like, or indicate that they've got excess product. And then it can find its way into like a number of channels. I don't want to call it like alternative sales channels because like sometimes it ends up just like ending up in the waste stream or ending up donated. But I think like that's an area where we've seen a lot of collaboration just because it ends up being like a win-win for all parties. And then they avoid tipping fees, which is I guess like the US equivalent of how much you have to pay if you throw something out. So that's why like food businesses would adopt there. An area that I think probably needs a little more collaboration, although it's a little tough because of like misaligned incentives, would be like the farmer or the food producer and like the retailer. Maybe I'm like stealing questions or I'm going ahead like what you want to ask next, but I think like that's an area where I think partnership needs to happen where the problem is a lot of the power ends up being like in the food producer or not the food producer, like the food retailer and not necessarily in the food producer. And so a lot of solutions that are being developed like favor the retailer. And so you don't have like a good level of like partnership between the two. I would say like an example would be that inventory management system or like the enhanced demand planning system. Those like allow the retailer to, let's say, effectively try to predict how much they're going to want or how much they're going to need. And so they end up putting like the exact order. So that ends up actually reducing the revenues of, let's say, a farmer, for instance. And so like, I think trying to find like ways that are a little more equitable, at least like on that end, we'll probably be able to get like better partnership there. And maybe I'm rambling a bit, but another area that I think we've seen a lot of, at least in the US and Canada too, is that farmers with excess product have also gone the route of like direct to consumer. So they've almost bypassed a good chunk of like the supply chain and are dealing more with like the consumer aspect. And that was, I think, a product of like one, like supply chains kind of like shut off like for a bit during COVID or like during the pandemic. But two, I think there is a movement towards like people wanting to be closer to like their food sources in the US. Like, I think globally that's either a reality or a desire. But I think in the US, that's one thing that is like that people are focusing in on. So technology being used by more of like the on-farm people to connect them to their ultimate customer is something that I've seen a lot of too.
Perfect, thank you. So we're talking a lot about the role of technology, and it definitely sounds like it has played, an important role in all of this traction. So if we look forward towards the unmet solutions, the future challenges, what has not been developed yet, and since I know the SST, audience here, many of us are more familiar or we represent more like the research or the academia. So I think it's interesting to understand that many of the food loss waste solutions require research and development validation. So where do you feel there might be, some remaining knowledge gaps where the research should focus in the following 5 to 10 years in order to support the noble science-based solutions. And I just want to mention one example, just from my point of view. I know that most of the circular economy solutions to connect, food systems and cities are promoting the composting, like centralized composting. And I think it's great, and it's also generating more awareness. However, there has also been some concern because the biofertilizer or, these soil amendments that result from the composting processes, we're starting to learn that when they come from, the organic, from the food waste from the cities, many times there is a presence of, microplastics. So maybe personally, I thought, well, we should be aware and we should develop some solutions or understanding of what is the risk of those microplastics, and if there is some kind of management strategies that we should approach, instead of just saying, if the waste is coming from the cities, there's no way that you can use that as a soil amendment to grow food, because that is exactly what we want to promote in a circular perspective. So that was just one of my personal opinions, but I want to hear what you guys at REFED are thinking about this research and development gaps.
Yeah, and Olivia, to build on that, I know that's one area that, maybe this isn't REFED's position, but I'm just personally interested in, because there's a lot more development now that's going into bioplastics. So for instance, people are trying to convert, let's say, algae or actual food waste into bioplastics. But there's still research going on to, okay, if you were to actually throw that into, let's say an ecosystem and have it degrade over time, what actually happens. And so I think I know there's some data that indicates, it actually ends up being a little too acidic. So it ends up acidifying the soil that it ultimately ends up going into. But I know there's more research that needs to be done there. Another area that I would have to say, at least from REFED's perspective, we don't necessarily monitor the patents and stuff that are going out. But one area that I think we think there's a lot of potential in is looking at precise food safety evaluation technologies. And so think of it as, if you were to leave food out for a 4-hour time limit, or you've had food that's you've left in your fridge or refrigeration unit for beyond a certain number of days. If you had a product or something that's a quick test that could examine it and then indicate if there's bacteria, at least at home or wherever, I think that would be a huge solve for food waste, at least from a residential perspective. I think there probably needs to be maybe more research to get testing solutions that are cheaper, because that's the one thing that I think is a big gap, is there's a lot of testing that is more for food safety across the supply chain, but it's not a good at-home product. But I think that's one area that we would like to see more research going into, is to make the testing cheaper so it's more accessible for those at home, for instance.
Great. That would be a product that I would like to see in the market, definitely. So Alejandro, you mentioned before, and I know that REFED resources have served as an inspiration for other countries, to start designing their own roadmaps and implement some solutions based on their reality. And here I have two questions. First, I would like to know what has been previous initiatives or countries that are today working with the REFED model, and how is that been working? And also, I would like to understand from the international perspective that we all know that different countries and regions face food waste challenges from different realities. And when I see all of these the list of solutions, I think all of them are great. However, when I see it from a perspective of my country's reality, so Latin America, I understand that some of those are not, feasible to be implemented. And I want to focus in maybe one of the main challenges that I see from the reality of my country, that there's like uncertainty of what are the potential of secondary markets. There is uncertainty of the economic feasibility, because it all sounds very innovative and added value solutions. But when you bring that idea or business model to developing country, is there really an opportunity to create that market? And how do you start gaining that traction? Maybe from the international experiences, you might bring some lights in how to start developing those secondary markets. And just to give you one example, here, like in Latin America, we see all of these compost and soil amendments that can be developed from the food waste. However, here in Chile, the demand for compost it's very, very limited. And even though we are a country that exports, the food sector is our second economic sector in our GDP. So it's like ironic that being a country that is producing so much food and exporting food and food for all of the globe and the world, we ourselves have no demand for those composts. So it's kind of, how can we promote or accelerate? And maybe some international experiences or thoughts might give us all some lights.
Those are all like great questions. I would say when it comes to the refed experience and individuals that we've dealt with globally, I would say like we've been mostly speaking to, I would say, government stakeholders. So I know we've spoken to like the government of Turkey, which is looking at refed's framework. Like they're using it as a framework. So it's not necessarily like, oh, okay, like here are all the recommended solutions that we're going to adopt. They have like our insights engine, and they're looking at like all the solutions that are out there, and then they're assessing it from their context, like what is actually going to be economically viable. Like Olivia, to your point about composting, like they're probably considering like the composting route like may not be the most viable for them because of the fact that it's a low value product and there's like little demand for it. So I'd say like that's how people are looking at it, is they're looking at it at a high level, and then they're going to come back to refed and have questions like, okay, like based on like these economic conditions, like what do you think is like the most appropriate? Where we've also got traction is, I would say, like from more like developed countries, like I would say like from municipalities actually. So Canada's municipalities, we've had a few that have come up to us, and then we've helped like walk them through like the solutions that are most appropriate to them. But I would say that probably to your second point, which was like about like secondary marketplaces and all those like individual tech items, I think those are tough to implement in like any region. And even in the US, it's taken a long time for that, because it took like basically a lot of time for them to just get an interest in, let's say, like imperfect produce versus like that may not even be in a market that exists in a developing country. And so how I would look at like the insights engine from that perspective is I would skew towards like what are going to be the areas that like regardless of geographic context you still have to address. So like on the at-home part, that's a huge area for food waste. For that, it's like it could be as easy as like better storage for food at home, and ensuring that like that is a huge thing like from the developing world that would greatly improve like food waste in general and like health in general. The other area I would think of is like, let's say you know that like you're getting X number of waste on farm, diverting it not to like other channels, but knowing that you can compost that like on farm and like return the nutrients to your soil. Like I think those are like important things to think about when you're looking like from your context. So I'd say like knowing where the food waste is happening, like from your geographic perspective, which will be like roughly similar to like what refed is presenting. And then from there, like understanding, okay, what is going to be the most appropriate solutions that can actually work here.
Thank you. It's all about, adapting all of that preliminary experience to the reality of each of the geographies. That's key.
Yeah.
I'm really glad to hear that countries like Turkey are already, using the framework, because it should be a great resource for many countries. Well, Alejandra, I have my last question. I would love to continue this discussion. I've really been learning a lot. But since you come from the capital, innovation, I would like to know from your expertise, what has been the role of REFED in catalyzing action through capital and innovation as key levers? And maybe you can provide some examples, or how do you see the trends in that area?
Yeah. Thank you for going towards where I can talk about. I would say that for capital innovation, REFED is always trying to find ways to engage capital or capital providers and get funding into the space. I think we've gravitated towards this idea of catalytic capital. It sounds like a buzzword, but basically it's dollars that can go in and stimulate projects that may not have a market or profit motive in the near term. And so this capital tends to be more flexible, concessionary. And so what would be bucketed in there would be government grants or philanthropic money or impact investing. And so I think that's where we've been really focused in trying to get money into the space, because once an idea is profitable or ready or has a lot of funding, I think at that point the work is done and it just needs to get adopted. But the role of capital can be really impactful in the early stages. And to give examples of that kind of work that REFED has done is we've done, I would say a lot more innovation challenges or accelerators. And these aren't necessarily scalable. It's not REFED can do 20 of these a year. It's usually one or two. But what we try to do is that these tend to be with very influential organizations. So think of an example would be the Wonderful Company in the US. So they do pomegranate juices, but a bunch of other stuff. But we help them run an innovation challenge through their philanthropic arm to try to look for food waste solutions to solve a specific problem of theirs. And so they were looking for, okay, we've got all this pomegranate husk that we keep in a refrigerator after getting all the juice. What can we do with that? And so we help them run this challenge. And by doing that, we actually just open their eyes to the food waste issue, the solutions that are out there. And now they're a regular funder of food waste solutions. They're also an adopter of solutions, and they're looking into considering getting into funding research related to food waste at I would say at institutions. So I think that's one example, but that's what we want to try to replicate that to get other people into the topic, and then they become regular funders of it. And we think we're most impactful at the earliest stage. So the solutions that they're looking at, they're more earlier stage, starting pilots, so that the goal is once they get that support, they could end up actually being a solution that other people can adopt or invest in.
Sounds like a very, very good model, and we should be looking that into replicating in other countries, because when you start with those early stage, at the end you will also create the traction for all of the entrepreneur space to continue to motivate and to see, as you mentioned before, it's good to have good quality, but also it's great to have user stories, and when you really have those entrepreneurs that started with an idea or this pomegranate challenge ended up with a real solution, scalable solution, and then you have the demand, and you connect not just accelerating the solution and the entrepreneurship space, but also connecting with the demand. I think that is one of the positive loops that we would like to see everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, it's been really, really interesting talking to you, Alejandro. I've been learning a lot and listening to your personal views and the future challenges for REFED makes me more excited about working in this space. So we really look forward to sending all of the SST attendees the links from the research insight. And if you have any other questions, you can connect directly to the SST email list for additional, comments or questions that you might not have time to put here in the chat. So thank you all for participating, and we look forward to continue today in this great virtual SST program that is just starting today.